Welcome to Sleep with Secrets, where bedtime gets darker and secrets never sleep. If you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe, because some stories disappear before they're ever heard again. And tell me, where in the world are you listening from tonight? I'd like to know where the secrets are spreading. Now get comfortable and let's get started. Story 1. The date was July 29th, 1884. The place, a wide stretch of the South Atlantic Ocean, not far off the quiet, steamy coast of Brazil. The sea was steady that morning, its gray-blue surface barely disturbed by the slow and steady movement of a German cargo ship known as the Moctezuma. Captain P.H. Simonson stood on the deck, the sun just beginning to climb behind his shoulders. He was a seasoned sailor, used to long voyages that passed through quiet moments like this. Lumber shipments from South America to Hamburg, routine days under the sky, steady waves ahead, and familiar charts beneath his boots. But today, something would interrupt the rhythm, something unexplainable. Simonson narrowed his eyes. Far ahead, barely visible on the horizon, was something floating, a tiny speck moving irregularly with the tide. Perhaps driftwood, he thought. Maybe wreckage. He'd seen plenty in his time. A loose board, the leftovers of another sailor's misfortune. But this shape was strange. As the Moctezuma approached, the shape grew more defined. A boat, a lifeboat, small, barely seaworthy. And then he saw them. 3 men slumped inside. Their skin was raw, their eyes hollow, and their bodies twisted into positions that looked unnatural, like they had fused with the boat itself. Simonson's breath shortened. He barked an order. The crew scrambled. Ropes were thrown. They carefully guided the lifeboat closer, afraid that even touching it might cause it to fall apart. The dinghy was just 13 feet long, weathered, cracked, barely held together with mismatched boards and rotting rope. Inside, the 3 men were barely alive, gaunt, sun-scorched. Their lips were cracked and their limbs seemed too weak to move. Captain Simonson offered them food, water, and rest. He had no reason not to. To him, they looked like survivors of some terrible shipwreck. Perhaps their ship had gone down. Perhaps they had drifted for days, praying for rescue. Perhaps this was just one more tragic tale of the sea. But he didn't know the whole truth, not yet. Later, after they were fed and given blankets, Simonson returned to the deck. His crew was lifting the tiny lifeboat aboard the Moctezuma. That's when they saw it. At first, just a dark smear along the floorboards, then something more. A chunk of flesh, unmistakably human, cold, wet. Blood still pooled around it. Simonson staggered back, his mouth went dry. His hands trembled. There was more. Bloodstains, bits of bone, the remains of what had once been a person. This wasn't just a story of survival. This was something else. He demanded the men be brought to him again. They arrived slowly, weakly, barely able to stand. And then one of them stepped forward, a man in his early 30s, sunburnt and pale. He held himself with the quiet posture of leadership. "My name is Thomas Dudley," he said, voice thin, "captain of the Mignonette." Simonson asked no questions, not yet. He let the man speak, and the story he told would haunt him for the rest of his days. To understand what happened, Captain Thomas Dudley had to take the story back to where it began, to a small village in England called Talsbury. Talsbury sat along the coast, tucked between the English Channel and the North Sea, a place where the wind always carried the salt of the ocean, and where seafaring wasn't just a job, it was a way of life. For generations, families there had made their living on the water, and by the late 1800s, it had become a center for yacht racing, a sport favored by the rich, who saw the sea as both entertainment and display. They came to Talsbury seeking skilled captains and crews, men who could navigate any tide, face any storm, and guide a ship with steady hands. Among those men was 31-year-old Thomas Dudley. Dudley had made a name for himself as a yacht captain. He had spent nearly a decade mastering the sport, guiding racing vessels across unpredictable waters. But the long months away from home had taken their toll. Dudley had a wife and 3 children, and the long absences were wearing him down. He craved something more stable. That spring, an opportunity came. A wealthy Australian lawyer named John Want was looking to purchase a yacht in Britain, and he needed a crew to sail it all the way to Sydney. The journey would stretch 15,000 miles from Southampton to the far reaches of Australia. It was long, risky, unpredictable, but it was also well paid. Dudley considered the offer carefully, discussing it with his wife. The contract was worth £200, more money than most sailors would see in a year, but it also meant another 4 months away from home. She hesitated. Another season alone. More nights with no word from her husband. She reminded him that their children needed him, that she needed him. He promised this would be the last time, a final voyage. And when he reached Sydney, he'd visit her aunt, perhaps even take over the small business she'd long talked about. They could settle, rest. Reluctantly, she agreed, and so Dudley accepted the contract. He would take command of the yacht, a vessel called Mignonette. The yacht had been built in 1867 as a luxury cruiser. It wasn't a large ship, but it had class. It had charm. For John Want, it was a symbol of status. But buying a new boat and transporting it to Australia would have been far too expensive. The Mignonette was old, but affordable. A compromise. Still, the thought of sailing such an aging vessel across the world made some in Tollesbury uneasy. The sea was unpredictable, and the route would take them through treacherous waters. Dudley didn't let the warnings deter him. He began assembling a crew. At first, he recruited 2 brothers to help sail the yacht from Tollesbury to Southampton, a short distance of about 200 miles. But when they arrived at the port, something changed. The brothers refused to go further. Their reasons were never explained. They simply turned back. Frustrated, Dudley began searching again. On May 15th, he hired 3 men. Edwin Brooks, 39 years old, a seasoned sailor. Edwin Stevens, 37, a skilled mate. And Richard Parker, a 17-year-old orphan eager to see the world. The next day, one of the new crew members, James Haynes, backed out without warning. Another sudden dropout. Dudley noted the odd pattern, but he continued on. Parker stayed. He was young, barely a man. But his life had already been marked by loss. His mother had passed when he was 7. His father died when he was 14. After that, Parker lived with a foster family in a fishing village much like Tollesbury. He grew up working on boats, hauling nets, and learning the tides. This voyage was his chance to go beyond the coast, to cross the ocean, to chase something bigger. His older brothers and foster mother cautioned him. This wasn't like fishing near home. The journey to Australia was long, dangerous, but Richard was determined. He had no wife, no children. He felt he had nothing to lose and everything to gain. So he said goodbye to his family and climbed aboard the Mignonette. On May 19, 1884, the yacht departed Southampton, its 4-man crew prepared to face the unknown. The ocean stretched endlessly before them. The Mignonette set out from Southampton, England on May 19, 1884. 4 men stood aboard. Captain Thomas Dudley, 31. Edwin Stevens, the mate, 37. Edmund Brooks, an experienced sailor, 39. And the youngest, Richard Parker, just 17. Their destination was Sydney, Australia, over 15,000 miles away. Captain Dudley had mapped their route carefully. It wasn't the traditional path. Instead of turning west toward South America and riding the trade winds, Dudley chose to hug the coast, heading south toward the Cape of Good Hope, then east to Australia. It was a slower path, but in his eyes, a safer one. The Mignonette wasn't built for deep-sea navigation. It had been a pleasure yacht, not a hardened cargo vessel. Dudley believed staying closer to land and following familiar coastlines would reduce their risk of encountering severe weather or high seas. For nearly a month, the voyage went smoothly. In June, the crew stopped in Madeira, a small Portuguese island, to restock supplies and send word to their families. Spirits were high. The men were healthy, and the ocean was kind. But that changed as they crossed into the South Atlantic. As they pushed deeper into the vast open waters, the wind turned rough, waves grew taller. Clouds gathered above like a warning. On June 25th, the storm hit. It struck fast and hard. The wind howled like a living thing. Rain slashed through the sails. The mignonette pitched and rolled in the angry sea. For 10 straight days, the men fought to keep the yacht alive. They baled water, secured the sails, held the wheel with blistered hands. But the storm was relentless. Every day brought another assault. Every night was colder and darker than the last. Then, on July 5th, it stopped. The sea fell quiet. The wind died. For the first time in over a week, the crew could breathe. Captain Dudley ordered the sails down. They would rest that night, regain strength, and resume in the morning. The men moved slowly, carefully preparing the yacht to anchor. Dudley gave instructions. Stevens helped reset the rigging. Brooks checked supplies. Young Parker was given a simple task: make tea below deck. It was calm, too calm. And then, just as night settled over the water, the sea betrayed them. A massive rogue wave rose in the darkness. It was silent until it wasn't, rising like a wall, a mountain of black water higher than the mast. There was no time to cry out. The wave crashed down, slamming into the mignonette with the full force of the ocean. Wood cracked, sails snapped. The deck split open. In seconds, the yacht was doomed. The rogue wave struck with terrifying force. In one breath, the mignonette was whole. In the next, she was broken. The ocean poured over the deck, ripping the yacht apart. The wave didn't just smash the sides. It tore through the protections, breaking the railings, the rigging, and everything that shielded the crew from the open sea. The storm had returned, and this time, it wouldn't give them a chance to fight. Captain Dudley shouted over the roar, "Brooks, Stevens, get to the dinghy!" They scrambled. The lifeboat was their only hope, a 13-foot dinghy made of thin plywood, barely seaworthy. But it was all they had. "Parker," Dudley called, "find one of the water barrels. We'll try to get it from the dinghy." Parker ran, hands shaking. Stevens and Brooks lowered the lifeboat into the waves. Dudley didn't follow, not yet. He turned back toward the lower deck. Water was rushing in, up to his chest, freezing cold and rising fast. But he forced himself down. He couldn't leave without the tools they might need to survive. The compass, the chronometer, the sextant. These 3 things could help them navigate if they ever found calm waters again. Dudley reached for them, gripping the soaked wood with numb hands. Then he fought his way back up, lungs burning, water nearly sweeping him under. He climbed into the dinghy just in time. 5 minutes later, the mignonette vanished beneath the waves. Gone. The 4 men sat in silence. The wind howled above them, and the sea swelled around the tiny lifeboat. They had escaped death for now. But the fight was only beginning. Their water casks had been lost. Only 2 tins of turnips floated close enough to grab. Worse, the lifeboat was leaking. In their panic, one of the sides had been kicked open, leaving a hole that let water in with every wave. Dudley searched the dinghy and found a scrap of cotton. He used it to plug the breach. It was a poor patch, but it would have to do. They fashioned a sea anchor, a piece of fabric tied with rope, to stabilize the lifeboat in the storm. It wasn't enough to steer them, but it kept them from capsizing in the swells. The wind didn't stop. The waves didn't stop. For 6 hours they bailed water constantly, working in shifts. Their muscles ached. Their skin burned. The salt stung their eyes. They didn't speak. They just tried to survive the night. When dawn broke, the storm had moved on. The sea grew quiet again, but peace didn't come with it. At around 11 that night, a new terror emerged, a knock. Something hit the side of the boat. They froze. In the dim moonlight, a shape moved beneath the waves, large, dark, circling. A shark. It brushed the dinghy again, slow and silent. None of them had weapons. No strength to fight. All they could do was stare, whisper prayers, and hope it would pass. Eventually it did. but the fear remained. The storm had passed, but the silence it left behind was heavier than the wind. The sea stretched endlessly, smooth and wide, with no sails on the horizon, no rescue, no help. And inside the tiny 13-foot dinghy, 4 men sat, drenched, burned, broken. They had no fresh water. Their food was almost gone, and they were hundreds of miles from any shore. Dudley took command as best he could. He knew they had to hold on to hope. If they lost that, they'd lose everything. He tore the bottom of his trousers and used the cloth to strengthen the patch over the hole in the lifeboat. Then he took off his shirt and some of the wooden planks from beneath their feet. With those, he built a makeshift sail. The men helped, though they were weak. One by one, they handed over pieces of clothing. It left them exposed to the cold nights and the sun's blistering heat, but they believed it might help carry them toward rescue. With the patch and the sail secured, Dudley turned to their next problem, food and water. They had only 2 small tins of turnips, barely enough to last even one day. He rationed them carefully, dividing them between the 4 of them, stretching every bite. For water, they had nothing. They were surrounded by ocean, but they couldn't drink it. Everyone knew drinking seawater only made things worse. It dried the mouth, poisoned the blood, and brought madness faster than thirst alone. Each passing hour brought more pain. Their lips cracked, their throats ached, their skin burned in the sun and froze at night. Their bodies, already weakened from days of fighting the storm, began to break down. Then, on July 9th, 4 days after the wreck, they spotted something. A turtle. It swam lazily near the dinghy, unaware of the desperation inside. Stevens lunged. His fingers grabbed its shell. He wrestled it into the boat. Without hesitation, they killed it and began to cut it apart. The meat gave them a burst of energy. It wasn't much, but it was something. They ate it slowly, carefully, chewing even the tough skin. They saved the blood. They even scraped what fat they could and swallowed it raw. It gave them hope, briefly. But that hope didn't last. The days passed, no more turtles came. No rain fell. The sun beat down without mercy. At first, they tried to collect dew in scraps of cloth. Then, when nothing came, they turned to a last resort. They drank their own urine. It wasn't enough. It only reminded them of how little they had left. 12 days passed. Their skin was burned and broken. Their hands shook from weakness. Their minds began to wander, flickers of hallucination that came and went with the heat. And then, the youngest among them, Richard Parker, began to fade. He had held on as long as he could. But at 17, with no sailing experience beyond the coast of England, Parker had been unprepared for this kind of suffering. His body was smaller, weaker, and his thirst had turned into panic. He did the one thing they had all feared. He drank the seawater. Dudley, Brooks, and Stevens tried to stop him, but they were too weak. Parker scooped up the salty water with his hands, gulping it desperately. Within hours, the sickness began. He vomited. He grew disoriented. Then came the fever. By nightfall, he was lying at the bottom of the dinghy, drifting in and out of consciousness. His body trembled. His eyes fluttered. His skin turned pale. The others watched him in silence. They knew what was coming, and they knew what it might mean for them. The sky remained empty. The sea stayed quiet. No ship appeared on the horizon. No shadow of rescue. Richard Parker lay at the bottom of the lifeboat, barely breathing, barely conscious. His skin had turned ashy. His lips were dry and cracked. His strength was gone. He could no longer sit up, no longer speak clearly. He was 17, the youngest among them, the least experienced, and now he was dying. Captain Dudley watched him, silent. He had never faced a situation like this. He had seen hardship at sea. He had survived storms. But this was different. This was slow and merciless. It had been 18 days since the Mignonette sank. The turtle meat was long gone. The turnips, gone. They had no more fresh water, no supplies, only hunger, only thirst, only silence. Dudley turned to Stevens and Brooks. His voice was hoarse when he spoke. "Come here," he said. We need to talk. The three men huddled together, careful not to disturb Parker. Dudley's tone was calm but serious. Lads, I fear our luck has run out. Stevens didn't respond at first. Neither did Brooks. It's been 18 days, Dudley continued. No sign of help, no ship, no land. Brooks stared at the bottom of the boat. Dudley lowered his voice. We may have to draw lots. Stevens looked up. You mean to choose one of us? It's the custom, Dudley said quietly. At sea, when death is certain, one life may mean the survival of the rest. Brooks shook his head. We can't. Dudley didn't argue. We sleep on it. The lifeboat returned to silence. That night they said nothing. But they all thought the same thing. They knew the stories. Sailors lost at sea, starving, forced to make the ultimate decision. It wasn't murder, not at sea. It was survival. They didn't want it to come to this. But each hour made it more real. Richard Parker didn't speak. He barely moved. He wasn't going to recover. Dudley watched him closely. Of the four of them, Parker had the least strength, the least chance of surviving, and no family waiting at home, no wife, no children. Brooks couldn't accept it. He refused to discuss it further. He would rather die than kill. But Dudley and Stevens were husbands, fathers. They had people waiting for them. They weren't thinking as sailors anymore. They were thinking as men who wanted to go home. The next morning came. Still no sails. Still no sign of rescue. Parker lay still, only shallow breaths escaping his lips. Dudley and Stevens exchanged a look. They had made their decision. If no rescue came by the end of the day, Parker would die. Not by the sea, not by thirst, by their hands. And the others would live. Morning broke. The sun rose slowly over the Atlantic, casting pale light across the endless water. The sea was still. The sky was bare. No ship came. No sails on the horizon. Inside the lifeboat, Richard Parker remained motionless. His breathing was shallow, his eyes closed, his body limp. Dudley sat quietly, holding something small in his hand, a penknife. The same knife he had used for years on the sea. But never like this. Brooks looked away. He didn't want to be part of it. He couldn't. Stevens stayed close. Dudley whispered a prayer. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. His voice trembled. Forgive me, Lord, for what I'm about to do. Then he looked at Stevens. Are you ready? He asked. Hold his legs if he moves. Stevens nodded. Dudley leaned over the boy. Richard, he said softly, your time has come. Parker didn't speak. He didn't resist. He was too far gone to understand what was happening, too weak to fight. Dudley raised the knife. One quick motion, the deed was done. The lifeboat went silent again. 3 men, 1 body. They had done what they swore they never would. They had taken a life, so they could keep their own. They drank first. They were dying of thirst. The blood brought them back from the edge. Then they turned to the body. They worked quickly, quietly. They removed the heart, the liver, the organs that could keep them alive. They didn't speak. They didn't look at each other. It wasn't a meal. It was survival. They stored the rest of the body out of sight, wrapped the remaining flesh, hid it beneath the boards. For 4 more days, they lived on what Richard Parker had left behind. They ate only what they had to. They spoke only when necessary. Dudley couldn't forget what he had done. Stevens kept his head down. Brooks stayed silent. They were no longer the men who had boarded the Mignonette weeks earlier. They were something else now. Changed. Marked. But they were alive. And the sea had one more twist to offer. The days that followed were quiet. The air was still. The ocean stretched in every direction. And inside the lifeboat, 3 men clung to life. Their strength had returned, but not fully. What kept them alive was also what haunted them. They ate in silence. They avoided each other's eyes. No one mentioned Parker's name. Dudley called it breakfast. Stevens answered with a nod. Brooks said nothing at all. Each man carried his thoughts quietly, staring out at the sea, waiting. Then, on the fourth day after Parker's death, Stevens saw something. He squinted against the sun, his voice low, uncertain at first. "I see a sail." Dudley turned, his heart pounding. There on the horizon, a small white shape, faint but real. Brooks stood slowly, his voice cracked. "Over here! Hey, over here!" They all shouted, waved, raised their arms with what little energy they had left. The sail moved closer. It was real. The Moctezuma, a German cargo ship hauling lumber from South America to Hamburg. And now, rescue. The lifeboat had floated over 1,050 miles. They were less than 1,000 miles from the coast of Brazil. The Moctezuma's crew lowered ropes, pulling the survivors on board. 3 men, thin, burned, half-starved. They were given food, water, shelter. The nightmare was ending. But as they stepped aboard, one question still waited to be answered. What happened to the 4th man? The crew hoisted the dinghy onto the deck. As they did, something shifted inside. A severed limb, chunks of flesh, dried blood. Captain Simonson, steady and experienced, went pale. He sent for the 3 survivors. Dudley came forward, quiet and calm. "My name is Thomas Dudley," he said. "Captain of the Mignonette. I'll explain everything." And he did. The story of the rogue wave, the storm, the drifting, the thirst, the sickness, and the choice. Simonson listened. He didn't interrupt. When Dudley finished, the captain ordered his crew to care for the men. They would be taken to England. They would go home. Nothing more was said. The dinghy was left behind, except for one part. A single human rib and a few pieces of flesh, the last of Richard Parker. 4 months after they had set out from Southampton, they returned, changed. On Saturday, September 6, 1884, the Moctezuma arrived at the port of Falmouth, England. The 3 survivors, Thomas Dudley, Edwin Stevens, and Edmund Brooks, stepped onto solid ground for the first time in weeks. They went directly to the customs house, as required of all arriving sailors. There, they reported the loss of the Mignonette and recounted the chain of events that had followed. Dudley spoke calmly, clearly. He gave the facts as he remembered them. The wave, the days adrift, Parker's illness, and finally, the act that had kept the 3 of them alive. Someone listened. Someone who wasn't just there to hear the story. Sergeant James Laverty of the local police had been nearby. He'd heard whispers of what the men had done. He wanted the truth, and he wanted it clearly. He stepped forward. "You say the boy was chosen to die so that you could live?" Dudley nodded. "Yes, sir." "What did you use?" Dudley reached into his belongings and held up the knife. Laverty took it from him. The penknife was small, worn, simple. "I'd like to keep this," Laverty said, "just while we sort things out." Dudley handed it over. He didn't protest. He didn't think he had to. He had done what he believed was necessary. That night, he sent word to his wife. He was coming home. But Sergeant Laverty had doubts. The details didn't sit right. There had been no drawing of lots, no agreement from Parker. The boy had been ill, weak, barely able to speak. And still, he was killed. It wasn't self-defense, it was survival, but at someone else's expense. Laverty began building a case. He had the knife. He had the survivors' own words, written in letters Dudley had prepared aboard the Moctezuma, meant for the yacht's owner and for legal reporting. They were detailed, clear, and they included full confessions. It didn't take long. Within hours, Dudley, Stevens, and Brooks were arrested, charged on suspicion of murder at sea. Dudley was stunned. He had expected sympathy, understanding, maybe even quiet respect for what they had endured. Instead, he was behind bars. He had survived the sea, only to face judgment on land. And outside the jail, something else was happening. Word of the case spread through Tallsbury and the nearby towns. The people who knew them, neighbors, families, fellow seamen, didn't turn away. They supported them. Even the mayor visited. Henry Lemmas stood beside them in the cell, apologizing for the arrest. But one visitor no one expected was Richard Parker's older brother, Daniel. He had read the news, learned what had happened, and when he came to the jail, he didn't yell, he didn't accuse, he offered his hand. Daniel Parker looked into the eyes of the men who had taken his brother's life and chose to forgive them. The public followed the case with fascination. Stories were printed, ballads were written. People raised money for the men's legal defense. In their eyes, these weren't criminals, they were survivors. But the law didn't see it that way, and the Crown was preparing to make an example of them. The case was unlike anything the country had seen. 3 sailors, 1 lifeboat, a dead boy, and a question that cut through every courtroom and every newspaper. Was it murder, or was it survival? The Crown had made its decision. It would prosecute Thomas Dudley and Edwin Stevens to the full extent of the law. Brooks would not stand trial. After reviewing the details, the court saw that he hadn't participated in the killing. He hadn't agreed. He hadn't assisted. He would testify instead. That left 2, Dudley, Stevens, and the weight of a nation watching. On November 3rd, 1884, the case officially opened. Regina v. Dudley and Stevens. The courtroom was packed. At the front stood the 2 men who had once battled storms and starvation. Now they stood before judges, lawyers, and a jury that would decide their fate. Arthur Collins, a lawyer representing the Queen's Counsel, took their defense. He spoke directly, firmly. "Gentlemen," he said, "I ask you to put yourselves in their situation. You are starving, thirsty, days from death, and one of you is already slipping away." He paused. "Would you not try to save yourselves? Wouldn't any man?" He turned toward the jury. "Self-preservation is the strongest human instinct, and if you are honest with yourselves, you know it's true." Then Thomas Dudley stepped forward. His voice was quiet. "Stevens and I, we did take Richard Parker's life, but it was not murder." He struggled to go on. "I will never forget what I saw," he said. "The way my companions looked after. It was like watching wolves, wild, desperate." He lowered his head. "We were not men in that moment. We were something else." The courtroom was silent. No one enjoyed it, no one wanted it, but it was necessary. The public supported them. Most saw them not as criminals, but as victims of the sea. Even the newspapers showed sympathy. But the man presiding over the case, Justice Baron Huddleston, had another view. He wasn't just looking at this one trial. He was thinking about the law itself. If the court accepted that necessity justified killing, where would it stop? He didn't want a world where survival could excuse anything. So instead of leaving it to the jury, he called for a special verdict. He would decide. The room was tense as Huddleston read his ruling. Thomas Dudley and Edwin Stevens, guilty of murder. By law, the sentence was death. The sentence was death. The courtroom sat in silence as Baron Huddleston made his ruling. Thomas Dudley and Edwin Stevens, guilty of murder on the high seas. And under English law, that crime carried only one punishment: execution. The words rang out, final and cold. But the story didn't end there. Even as the court declared them guilty, another force was already at work, one that wouldn't stay silent: the people. From Talsbury to London, from sailors to school teachers, voices rose in protest. They had followed every moment of the trial, and many believed the wrong men were being punished. The act had been brutal, yes, but it had also been necessary. The defense moved quickly. They filed for royal clemency and appealed to reduce the sentence. And behind that appeal stood not just legal arguments, but public pressure. Petitions, letters, articles. Even the lawyer who had led the prosecution supported the appeal. And the Crown listened. On December 12, 1884, a decision was made. The death sentences were set aside. Dudley and Stevens would not hang. Instead, they were each sentenced to 6 months in prison. Thomas Dudley accepted the punishment, but deep down, he carried something heavier than the law. He had been a father, a husband, a sailor trusted to lead. Now he was a man marked forever by a choice no one ever wants to make. He believed he had done what was right, what was required, what survival demanded. But the weight of Parker's death never left him. The case of Regina v. Dudley and Stevens didn't fade. It became one of the most studied legal decisions in history. Law schools still teach it today, and it raises the same question again and again. Is it ever justifiable to take one life to save others? What would you have done, adrift at sea, no hope, no help, and death growing closer every day? Would you have waited, or would you have reached for the knife? The storm had passed, but the waves it left behind continued to ripple. After serving just 6 months in prison, Thomas Dudley and Edwin Stevens were released. They walked free men, but they were not the same. Their names were known across the country, their story told and retold, in courtrooms, in newspapers, in classrooms. They had lived through one of the most harrowing survival stories in modern history, but they had also stood trial for murder, and that trial left behind something far larger than any of them. The case of Regina v. Dudley and Stevens became a cornerstone in legal history, not because of what happened at sea, but because of what it forced the courts to confront, the question of necessity. Could killing ever be justified by survival alone? Before this case, it was often assumed that yes, it could. Customs of the sea allowed for it. Shipwrecked sailors had long relied on that grim tradition, but this case said otherwise. Baron Huddleston's ruling drew a line. He declared that necessity was not a defense for murder, not even at sea, not even when death was certain. The judgment didn't erase the horror of what Dudley and Stevens endured. It didn't make them villains, but it made something clear. The law would not bend, even for the ocean. Today, their story is studied in law schools around the world. It's used to teach the trolley problem, a moral puzzle asking whether it's right to sacrifice one life to save others. In real life, Thomas Dudley made that choice. Edwin Stevens stood with him, and Richard Parker never got to speak for himself. There were no victors in this story, only survivors, only questions, only a lifeboat drifting in an ocean too wide and too quiet, and a name, Richard Parker, that history will never forget. Still with me? If you're enjoying this and want more, go ahead and like the video and subscribe. I share a new story every night. Your support helps the channel grow and keeps the secrets coming. Now, let's get into story 2. Story 2. The date was Thursday, October 3rd, 1991. The sun rose gently over North Park, a quiet neighborhood tucked inside the city of San Diego, California. On the surface, it seemed like the kind of place where danger had no home. Tree-lined streets, early 20th century craftsman houses, and the soft rustle of canyon winds painted a portrait of suburban calm. But beneath the calm, San Diego carried a darker story, especially during the early 1990s, when crime statistics soared above national averages. Violent crimes, burglaries, and missing persons cases had begun to trouble the city like never before. And on that morning, one of those stories began to unfold inside a modest apartment just blocks away from Switzer Canyon. 9-year-old Amanda Gale Keiki, known lovingly by her family as Mandy, had spent the night sleeping on the couch. Her mother, Marlene, rose early as usual, moving through the quiet kitchen and brushing past the small figure curled beneath a blanket. For a moment she paused and looked at her daughter, taking in the peaceful stillness of Mandy's face. Time felt strange in those early hours. Marlene couldn't help but marvel at how quickly her little girl was growing up. Soon Amanda stirred. So did her older sister Shauna, who was just starting her teenage years at 14. The apartment buzzed with the routine of school mornings, rushed breakfasts, backpacks slung over shoulders, and quiet words exchanged in half-awake voices. Amanda had been unusually frustrated that morning. She couldn't get her hair just the way she wanted. Her mother remembered it clearly, how determined Mandy had been, standing in front of the mirror, tugging her brush and trying again. When she finally finished, dressed and ready in her favorite outfit, she looked proud and beautiful. All three of them stepped outside together. Shauna headed toward the middle school in one direction, and Amanda, full of energy, climbed onto her purple and pink bicycle, a birthday gift from just 2 months earlier. Her route to elementary school was only a few blocks away. Marlene pulled her car out of the garage, watching in her rearview mirror as her youngest daughter pedaled down the street. She watched for as long as she could, until Amanda disappeared from view. Marlene drove off, unaware that this would be the last time she would ever see her daughter alive. Marlene's workday unfolded with a sense of normalcy. She had stayed an hour later than usual that Thursday. Typically, she would leave work by 3 p.m., but she had some overtime to complete. It was no cause for concern, not yet. She still had plans that evening. Amanda's school was holding an open house, and they were both looking forward to it. Amanda had only recently been promoted to a new elementary school. It felt like a milestone, one of those small but meaningful transitions that mark growing up. Marlene was eager to visit the campus, to walk beside her daughter through the halls and hear her talk about her teachers, her desk, her favorite parts of the day. Before heading home, Marlene made a quick stop at the grocery store. She picked up dinner, chicken nuggets for the girls, and hurried back to the apartment. By the time she pulled into the driveway, it was just past 5 p.m. That left her an hour before the open house. The oven warmed as the nuggets baked. Shauna was already home, but Amanda still wasn't. That's when the first pinprick of unease began to settle in Marlene's chest. Amanda had never been late coming home, not without calling, not without a reason. She was dependable, careful in her routines, especially on a day like this when she was looking forward to something. Around 5:45 p.m., the phone rang. Marlene hoped it would be Amanda. It wasn't. It was Jessica, Amanda's best friend, calling to ask if she could speak to her. Marlene hesitated. That didn't make sense. Amanda wasn't home. If Jessica didn't know where she was, who did? Jessica explained that she hadn't seen Amanda that afternoon. A recent injury had kept her from riding her bike, something the two of them usually did together after school. They hadn't spent time together that day. Now the unease in Marlene's chest deepened. Amanda should have been home before 5. She knew about the open house. She had looked forward to it. She wouldn't just disappear. As the clock ticked past 6, Marlene and Shauna stepped outside. They scanned the streets, calling her name, hoping to spot a flash of purple and pink from Amanda's bike. A neighbor handed Marlene a sweater and a bicycle pump, items one of the girls had left behind. It was a small, strange moment, made heavier by the silence that followed. Marlene returned inside. Still, no sign of Amanda. The minutes dragged. Dinner grew cold. The oven was turned off. By 6:45, Marlene told Shauna, if Amanda wasn't home by 7 o'clock, they'd begin searching. They didn't wait long. At 7 o'clock sharp, the two left the apartment and began walking the neighborhood. They visited 4 houses, homes of Amanda's friends, all within a few blocks. Each conversation was short. No one had seen her. No one had expected her. Finally, a girl close to Amanda's age recalled seeing her earlier that afternoon, right after school had let out. That day had been a half day. Students were released early so teachers could prepare for the open house. Amanda had stayed briefly at an informal after-school program, just a loosely monitored time where kids could play outside under the supervision of a staff member. But something had happened. The girl explained that Amanda had gotten into a bit of trouble. Maybe she was too rough during a game or had trouble sharing. Whatever the reason, she was told to leave, sent home. Marlene was stunned. That program was supposed to offer safety after school, someplace children could stay until their parents came home. But Amanda had been dismissed and no one had informed her. Instead, Amanda had returned home alone, changed out of her school clothes, and left again on her bicycle. The school clothes were later found in the hamper, a quiet confirmation that the girl had intended to get ready for the open house. but by then she was gone. The more Marlene learned, the more panic took hold. Amanda had last been seen around 4:30 p.m., riding her bike. That meant something must have happened between then and the time her mother came home at 5 o'clock. Back at the apartment, Marlene and Shauna regrouped. They had knocked on doors, spoken to friends, asked everyone who might know anything. Still, Amanda was nowhere. They made one final decision. Shauna would go to the school, just in case Amanda had gone ahead on her own. Marlene would revisit 2 more homes where Amanda's friends lived. It was getting dark. People were on porches, walking dogs, watering lawns. They asked anyone they saw, "Have you seen a little girl on a bike?" Most shook their heads. One boy said yes. He had seen her, riding quickly, but he didn't know where she was going. Shauna and Marlene returned home around the same time. Neither had found Amanda. Now it had been over 2 hours since she should have been home. The apartment, once busy with plans for the open house, was now filled with worry, the kind that sits in your stomach and spreads through your chest like ice. Marlene picked up the phone and called the police. When the officer arrived at the apartment, Marlene expected urgency. What she received instead was calm dismissal. The officer asked a few questions, then began casually walking through her home. He looked under beds, opened closets, peered behind furniture, as if Amanda might be hiding somewhere inside. Marlene watched him in disbelief. "She's not here," she said, her voice rising with desperation. "I've already checked. I wouldn't have called you if I hadn't." Marlene didn't buy it. Her daughter wasn't like that. Amanda didn't run away. She was happy, excited for school, eager for the open house. She wouldn't disappear voluntarily, and she certainly wouldn't ignore her mother's calls to come home. As the officer continued his half-hearted inspection, Marlene's frustration turned to fury. Her daughter was missing, and no one seemed to care. But Marlene wasn't imagining things. In fact, San Diego in the early 1990s had been plagued by a chilling pattern of child disappearances, cases that remained unsolved, each one more heartbreaking than the last. She wasn't being paranoid. She was living in a city where children had vanished without a trace, and many of their families had never found justice. San Diego had a history, a dark one. Stranger abductions of children were rare across the country, but in this city, they had become disturbingly frequent, and Amanda's mother knew it. She didn't need statistics to sense the danger that was circling. She had every reason to be afraid. In 1977, a 6-year-old boy named Luis Ramirez was reported missing. 2 days later, his body was found in a local park. A convicted offender eventually admitted to the crime. A year after that, in 1978, 2 teenage boys, John Mirsky and Michael Baker, were kidnapped from a parking lot and later shot. One of the victims' fathers, a San Diego detective, ended up arresting the man who had taken his son. At the time, he had no idea that one of the boys involved was his own child. In 1986, a 14-year-old girl named Ricky Ann Blake vanished from her Chula Vista home. A day later, her body was discovered by an exit ramp off Interstate 15. It would take 2 decades for her killer to be brought to justice. Then there was Charity Karen, just 7 years old. She was reported missing in 1988. Her skull was discovered a year later in a canyon. Her killer was never found. In 1989, Leticia Hernandez disappeared while playing outside her home. Her remains were found 2 years later. Like Charity's, her case remained unsolved. And then, the year Amanda vanished, 1991, another 9-year-old girl, Laura Arroyo, answered a knock at the door of her Chula Vista home and was never seen alive again. Her body was found the next day in an industrial park, but her killer wasn't caught until 2005. Just weeks later, in July of that same year, Rashida Wells disappeared while playing outside the hotel where she lived with her mother in downtown San Diego. A major search was launched, but Rashida was never found. This wasn't hysteria, this was reality. San Diego had become a place where children were disappearing, and their names were becoming part of a growing list of unsolved tragedies. And now, Marlene feared, Amanda was part of that list. By now, Amanda had been missing for over 12 hours. The first 24 hours in any missing child case are critical, but the response so far had been underwhelming. Marlene's pleas were met with patience, but not urgency. Late that night, around midnight, another officer visited the apartment. This time, the tone was more professional. He gathered information, asked detailed questions about Amanda's habits, and assured Marlene they would begin a wider search in the morning. But there was one caveat. They couldn't involve the media until Amanda had been missing for a full 48 hours. Marlene agreed, even though the waiting was unbearable. The next morning, police canvassed the neighborhood. They retraced Amanda's usual route, spoke with residents, teachers, classmates, anyone who might have seen her after school. But what they found only confirmed what Marlene had already learned the night before. Amanda had been asked to leave the after-school program. She returned home, changed clothes, then went to a friend's house nearby. She stayed there until about 4:30 p.m. The last known sighting of her came from a neighbor who said he saw her riding her bike after she left that friend's house. And then, nothing. No one else had seen her. She had vanished. Detectives turned their focus inward, starting with the people closest to Amanda. It was standard procedure, and that meant speaking to Amanda's father. His name was Frederick Koki. He and Marlene had divorced a few years earlier. Marlene explained to detectives that although she still cared for him deeply, their marriage hadn't survived his struggle with substance abuse. Frederick had battled addiction, and eventually that battle had landed him in prison on drug-related charges. Still, she insisted, this wasn't his doing. He loved Amanda. They weren't on bad terms. But detectives couldn't rely on sentiment. They needed to investigate every possibility, including whether someone from Frederick's world, perhaps an associate from his past, might have played a role. Their attention quickly shifted to one man, Justin Paez. He had been arrested alongside Frederick during a major drug bust in San Diego. Recently, he'd been released from prison and was now living with his mother in the same North Park neighborhood where Amanda had disappeared. When detectives approached him, he claimed to know nothing. He said he didn't even know Frederick had a daughter, but as the conversation continued, cracks started to show. He eventually admitted that he did know Amanda. He called them special friends. The phrase was disturbing, alarming even. Detectives took note. Paez said he was simply being kind to Amanda. He knew her father was incarcerated and he felt bad for her. That was the extent of their connection, he claimed. He denied seeing her on the day she disappeared. Detectives asked him to take a polygraph. He agreed. During the test, he admitted to owning a red pickup truck, something he'd failed to mention earlier. A witness had seen Amanda speaking with a Hispanic man driving a red truck shortly after leaving her friend's house. The man had loaded her bicycle into the back, and Amanda had climbed into the cab willingly. That detail made investigators uneasy. The polygraph results showed no signs of deception. Still, red flags remained. He had lied about knowing Amanda. He had downplayed his connection to Frederick, and now he was tied, however loosely, to the last known sighting of Amanda Keiki. They didn't have enough to arrest him, but they weren't letting him go from their radar. Not yet. Days passed. The search widened. Volunteers and officers spread out across North Park and beyond, combing through alleyways, parks, and nearby canyons. Flyers were posted on street poles, storefronts, and school fences. Amanda's photograph, bright-eyed, full of life, looked back at strangers across the city. Despite the growing pressure, there were no breakthroughs. Justin Paez remained a person of interest, but without physical evidence or a confession, detectives couldn't move forward. Then, 11 days after Amanda vanished, the case took a devastating turn. On October 14th, a couple walking through a canyon near 32nd and Redwood, just blocks from where Amanda had last been seen, noticed something strange tucked beneath a cluster of bamboo. They had stumbled upon human remains. Police arrived quickly and secured the scene. The body was wrapped in a white sheet with thin blue squares. A plastic shopping bag covered the head, its logo, Save On, still visible. Only one part of the body was exposed, a child's foot, toenails painted pink. Detectives notified Marlene. They couldn't confirm it yet, but they believed the body might be Amanda's. The medical examiner would need to perform an autopsy before any official identification could be made. Marlene waited. Hours passed. Then came the knock at her door. The medical examiner stood with detectives, their faces drawn and solemn. Amanda was gone. Marlene collapsed. Her daughter, her bright and curious little girl, had been found lifeless in a canyon less than a mile from home. She had been stripped of her clothes. A piece of stocking was tied around her neck. The level of decomposition suggested she had died 7 to 10 days earlier, meaning, chillingly, she had likely not been placed in the canyon immediately after her disappearance. Toxicology reports later revealed something even more horrifying. Amanda had alcohol in her system. Her blood alcohol level was high, dangerously so for a child. There were also traces of a stimulant. She had been kept in a dazed, weakened state before her life was taken. Whoever had done this had not only harmed Amanda, they had held her. They had controlled her. They had known exactly what they were doing. Crime scene investigators documented everything. They found more than Amanda's body in that canyon. Lying nearby was a small pile of trash. Among the discarded items was a receipt with a single name printed on it, Kim. It didn't match anyone in Amanda's family. They also noted the Save On bag. There was a store by that name in the area. Detectives reached out, asking whether anyone named Kim worked there or was a regular customer. Nothing, no clear lead. Still, there was a trace of hope. A sample had been recovered from the sheet Amanda's body was wrapped in. It revealed the suspect's blood type. It wasn't enough to identify someone by name, but it was enough to rule people out. Justin Paez was asked to submit a sample. He agreed. His blood type didn't match. That part of the investigation ended there, but suspicion never completely disappeared. The evidence remained sealed from the public. Media reports mentioned a blanket, but not a sheet. They didn't report on the Save On bag. They didn't mention the toxicology results. The police kept these details hidden, not to cover anything up, but to preserve the integrity of the case. If a suspect came forward or a confession was made, they needed a way to separate fact from fiction. Marlene knew the truth. The detectives had told her everything. But they asked her not to speak publicly about the condition in which Amanda was found. She agreed. Her only goal now was justice. The case was open. The search was ongoing. But Amanda Keike's life had been stolen, and no one knew who had done it. Not yet. In the days that followed Amanda's discovery, the neighborhood that once bustled with familiarity grew quiet. People locked their doors earlier. Children no longer rode their bikes past dusk. The shock of Amanda Keike's death settled like a fog over North Park. But behind the scenes, investigators were not slowing down. The search for her killer was ongoing. Among the steady stream of calls to the police tip line, one voice stood out. A minister had reached out, calm and concerned. He told detectives that 2 of his parishioners, a couple he had known for some time, might be connected to Amanda's death. At first, the detectives hesitated. They had received dozens of tips involving cults, strangers, and wild theories. Many were influenced by fear and confusion. But then the minister gave the names. Percy and Carla Guilford. The detectives paused. Those names were familiar. It was the Guilfords who had discovered Amanda's body in the canyon. They had called the police, claiming they found the remains while walking near the bamboo thickets behind their home. Now, the minister was telling police that this same couple had confided in him, spoken about dark thoughts, spiritual forces, and rituals. He said Percy in particular had often spoken of the devil, that he believed children were chosen for sacrifice. It sounded bizarre, even surreal, but it couldn't be ignored, and there was more. The Guilfords lived just 20 yards from where Amanda's body had been found. From one of their windows, investigators realized, you could see the exact spot where Amanda's remains were discovered. That wasn't coincidence. Detectives returned to the Guilfords' home, this time not as a thank you for their tip, but with quiet suspicion. They asked more questions, under the pretense of gathering additional information. Percy Guilford spoke freely. He told them about his beliefs. He said it was possible Amanda had been taken as part of a ritual. He spoke again of sacrifice, of October being a sacred month. To the detectives, his words were unsettling. The couple looked ordinary on the outside, quiet, religious, polite. But now, their words and their proximity to the crime scene couldn't be ignored. Further investigation revealed a troubling history. There had been reports of drug use and child neglect. Nothing had ever led to formal charges, but the red flags were undeniable. The police asked the Guilfords to take polygraph tests. Both agreed. They passed. They also gave blood and saliva samples. The results came back. Their blood types did not match the one found on the evidence from Amanda's sheet. That, combined with the past polygraphs, meant they could not be tied physically to the crime. Still, the detectives couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. How had Percy and Carla found Amanda's body so quickly, so neatly, tucked into an area no one else had checked? And why was Percy so quick to offer theories involving rituals and sacrifices? But in the end, suspicion alone was not enough. The test cleared them. The evidence didn't point to them. So, investigators shifted direction again. They had to keep looking. With the Guilfords cleared, detectives found themselves back at the beginning, again. Amanda's case, like so many others in San Diego, was growing cold. Weeks turned into months, then years. The investigation never officially closed, but leads thinned. Tips slowed, hope dimmed. Then, in 1996, 5 years after Amanda vanished, an unexpected voice brought the case back to life. A teenage girl, just 14, was staying in a psychiatric hospital for children. She had been placed there after suffering a complete mental breakdown. Her father, a registered offender, had been abusing her for years. The trauma she endured had caused deep psychological damage. She had finally come forward, revealing the extent of the pain she had hidden for so long. He was arrested. While under care, the girl began speaking to a nurse. Quietly, painfully, she shared something else, something even darker. She said she had witnessed a murder. She told the nurse her father had killed Amanda Kiki. The nurse alerted police. Detectives, now reassigned to the cold case, came to the hospital to speak with the girl. She told them that she and Amanda had been in the same class back in 1991. On the day Amanda went missing, they had played together. At one point, Amanda had followed her into a canyon, unaware of what was waiting. Her father, she said, had been hiding there. She described how he had suddenly attacked Amanda. He had taken her, hurt her, and ended her life. Then he had turned to his daughter and told her, if she ever spoke, he would do the same to her. For 5 years, she had kept the secret buried. The detectives listened carefully, but there was a problem. Amanda hadn't been killed in the way this girl described. She said her father used a weapon, but Amanda had died from asphyxiation. Still, doctors explained that her memory might have shifted under the weight of trauma. What she witnessed may have blurred in her mind. The horror remained, if not in exact detail, then in experience. The man, her father, was out of prison by that point, having completed his sentence. Detectives located him and brought him in for questioning. He denied everything. He took a polygraph and failed, but his blood type didn't match the evidence collected from Amanda's sheet. He was ruled out. It was another dead end, another turn in a case that refused to close, another family pulled into the shadows of Amanda's story and released when the truth didn't hold. The detectives kept going, and then finally a real lead surfaced. Later that same year, in 1996, an inmate inside the San Diego County Jail requested to speak with detectives handling Amanda's case. He wasn't just another prisoner looking for attention. He had something to say. He told them his friend had confessed to a terrible crime. He said this friend had taken a young girl, done unthinkable things to her, and left her in a canyon. He told detectives the girl had been wrapped in a sheet. A plastic bag had been placed over her head, and she had been transported in a trash can before being dumped in the brush. The detectives listened closely. Only someone who had been at the scene, or spoken to someone who was, could know those details. The inmate gave the name David Webb Kim. The detectives were stunned. That name had appeared in their notes before. David Kim had been interviewed back in 1991. He was the young man who told officers he saw Amanda riding her bike that afternoon. At the time, he had seemed like a cooperative neighbor. He had said very little, just that he was watering his grass, that he'd seen her go by. Now, 5 years later, someone was saying he was the one responsible. And suddenly, everything began to click. David Kim had lived only a few houses away. The canyon where Amanda was found was right behind him. Detectives pulled the original interview notes. He had placed himself at the scene, casually, quietly. They remembered him now. A teenager at the time, only 16 years old. They brought him in for questioning. He sat across from them, calm, composed. He admitted to knowing Amanda, said he'd seen her around the neighborhood, but he denied having anything to do with her death. He offered nothing more. So they let him sit. Meanwhile, detectives execute a search warrant at his mother's house, where he still lived. Inside, they found a set of bed linens, pillowcases, a fitted sheet, all matching the same white and blue pattern as the sheet Amanda had been wrapped in. Only one item was missing, the top sheet. That was enough. Back at the station, detectives returned to the interrogation room. They told David what they had found. He didn't argue. He didn't ask questions. He asked for a deal. If they would take the death penalty off the table, he'd confess. They agreed. And then David Webb Kim told them everything. David Kim sat in the interrogation room, the silence stretching between words like a slow breath. He knew the detectives had enough to tie him to the crime. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't resist. He asked for a plea deal. And when they agreed to remove the death penalty from consideration, he began to talk. He told them what happened on October 3rd, 1991. Amanda had been riding past his house that afternoon, just as he'd claimed 5 years earlier. She was upset, he said. Her clothes had gotten wet, and she didn't want to go home like that. She was worried she'd get in trouble. He offered to help, said she could come inside and dry her clothes. She agreed. Once inside, he gave her a towel and told her she could change in the bathroom. She handed him her clothes so he could put them in the dryer. Then, he said, she followed him into his bedroom while they waited. That was when everything changed. He gave her alcohol, then more. He offered her substances to keep her calm, subdued. She grew quiet, barely conscious. Then he tied her up. He said he kept her hidden under his bed for 2 days while he went to school, while his mother came and went from the house. Amanda was beneath his bed. Detectives were stunned. He admitted that when Marlene, Amanda's mother, had knocked on doors the evening she disappeared, he had spoken to her. And Amanda was still alive, just feet away. He said that when police officers came the next day to canvass the neighborhood, she was still under his bed. For 2 days, he kept her tied, drugged, and out of sight. He said that each time he returned to the room, he gave her more to drink, more of the substances. He admitted to harming her repeatedly during that time. Each time, he said, he tightened a piece of stocking around her neck, until eventually, she stopped breathing. Only then did he act. He wrapped her in a bed sheet, one that matched the set found in his house. He covered her head with a plastic bag from the nearby Save-On store. Then he placed her in a trash can and rolled her out to the canyon behind the house. He dumped her body in the bamboo. Then he went back inside and said nothing for 5 years Detectives tested the sheet Amanda had been found in. David's blood matched the evidence. He was arrested and charged with multiple counts, including kidnapping, abuse, and homicide. But because he had been 16 at the time of the crime, the state could not seek the death penalty. He was sentenced to life in prison, no parole, no appeals. He had confessed to everything. There was nothing more to say. When David Webb Kim stood before the court, the weight of what he had done filled the room. The judge listened to every word, every detail of the confession. Amanda's family sat nearby, Marlene, Shauna, and Amanda's father, Frederick. The pain was visible in their faces. Nothing about this trial was routine. Nothing about this sentencing was simple. David Kim showed little emotion. He did not fight the charges. He gave up his right to appeal. The court sentenced him to life in prison. Because he had been a minor at the time of the crime, the death penalty was not on the table. That detail haunted many. What he had done didn't feel like the act of a child. The courtroom grew tense as Frederick Keiki, Amanda's father, stood. Emotions overwhelmed him. He tried to confront Kim, restrained only by officers. He had already served time for his own mistakes, but nothing he had done could compare to what had been done to Amanda. The court didn't allow him to speak further. He was escorted out. His grief was uncontrollable. Marlene sat quietly. Her pain, too deep for words, filled the silence left behind. Shauna, Amanda's older sister, had lived with the nightmare for years. She had known David Kim. He was just 2 years older than her. They had grown up on the same street. It wasn't a stranger who had taken Amanda. It was someone from their neighborhood, someone who had looked them in the eyes. The case didn't end in the courtroom. It left a mark on the city of San Diego. Amanda's murder was one of several that forced the city to look inward, to examine how it was handling crime, child safety, and neighborhood policing. San Diego in the early 1990s had been a dangerous place. Crime was surging, gangs were rising, and children like Amanda were becoming victims. David Kim had been showing signs, leaning toward violence, falling into dangerous behaviors. Some said the system missed its chance to stop him before it was too late. Amanda Keiki would have been 39 years old today. She might have had children of her own, a career, a life full of memories never made. Instead, her story became a case file, a name on a list. But thanks to her family and the detectives who never stopped looking, her killer was found. And justice, even if delayed, was served. If this case affected you or made you think about how society treats its most vulnerable, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Not for the views, but because the more we remember these names, the less likely they are to be erased. Another case drops tomorrow. Until then, thanks for watching, stay safe, and take care of each other.